Hello and welcome to another edition of the Occult Book Review. This week's book is The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World by Catherine Nixey. Already quite a divisive volume. Before I go on with the book, I just want to say if you haven't been keeping up with the blog, there are other reviews that you can read. John Lockley's Leopard Warrior, The Metaphysical World of Isaac Newton, Alchemy, Prophecy and the Search for Lost Knowledge by John Chambers. That one is in the last edition of New Dawn magazine. And in this month's upcoming New Dawn magazine, I'll be reviewing Sorcery, The Invocation of Strangeness by Thomas Sheridan, and Decoding Maori Cosmology, The Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture by Laird Scranton. So you can catch up with what I think of all of those books if you buy New Dawn magazine. So to this month's book then, The Darkening Age. I think what I have to say is your preconceptions about Christianity will certainly determine quite a lot of what you think of this book. It's, as I've mentioned, it's already a very divisive book. If you go online, you can find academic scholars who love it, academic scholars who hate it. You can also strangely find quite a lot of atheists who hate it. Now, my own conclusion about a lot of these atheist accounts is that they are actually Christian evangelical sock puppet accounts. In other words, false identities created by Christian evangelicals to put down the position of the mythist version of Jesus and Christianity. And they continue on basically trying to attack anything that tries to bring to light how destructive Christianity actually was and how we've been influenced by Christian academic writers who really had no choice through the society they were living in and the threat of violence to actually propagate the Christian mythos itself. One thing I've really come to believe and carry with me is that the opposite of Christianity is not atheism. The opposite of Christianity is eternalism. That is an extension and survival of consciousness that doesn't depend upon a God figure. Now, there are different versions of this, different types of Buddhism, Hinduism, paganism, but you know, that seems to be what the kind of king-like figure, spearhead of Christianity seems to be pushing against. They certainly have a strange bedfellow in the kind of what would you say, the cooperation that's taking place between atheists and mainstream Christians. But that's kind of off on a tangent, but I just wanted to put that out there because it becomes important to how I see this book anyway. You know, I need to see that Christianity was pushing against paganism. It wasn't pushing against a non-belief as such. Now, the book will take a long time to kind of reverberate fully and be understood without controversy. I think if you look at Edward Gibbon's book, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, that was 200 years before people started to say, okay, then it is quite a fair look at what Christianity was like. And Nixey is bringing to light not just new information, but gaps in information. And that's really important because, as she demonstrates throughout the book, the amount of texts, art, history that have been destroyed by Christians in the classical world, and I'll come to other contexts later, but these gaps are what's important. And because Christian writers didn't write about them, they didn't write about them in a way that we were able to commend and look at these people with what would you say, appreciation. It's usually through Christian apologists criticizing them that we can pick together what these previous pagan philosophers thought. And she gives countless examples of pagan thinkers whose works have been destroyed and burnt, obviously. The book goes into Nixey's own ideas as to how Christianity took root, the cultural reasons, and of course the empirical reasons. And what I mean by that is how Constantine was looking for a way to acquit himself morally of a lot of the atrocities he had committed. And so Christianity gave him that outlet, because there was a responsibility to the pagan gods at the time, and their sense of ethics, I would argue, was much stronger. Constantine couldn't have gotten away with what he actually done, but he was able to do that through Christianity. There are different theories, of course, and that's for another time. Anyway, the result of all of this was that it became more and more difficult to be a pagan. Edicts began to come about, and you had to, sacrifices were banned, and sacrifices weren't just animal sacrifices or anything like that. It was even burning incense, saying a prayer, basically to worship at pagan temples. So more and more for the common person, it became more about fear for your livelihood, and of course fear for your life. So conversion was forced, and eventually it was completely forced, because it was a death penalty came in for being pagan. Now, Nixey goes into the figures in the book, and she talks about how many Christians were actually persecuted, as opposed to the kind of mainstream Christian view which has permeated our own culture until now. She talks about then how many pagans were actually persecuted and killed, and there's a huge discrepancy in the real numbers and the numbers that have been put out there for like centuries. And this is where a lot of the Christian criticism seems to come in, because for most of our history, in the Western world, it has been written by Christians for Christians. And this is not just the controversial aspect, but it's something that we need to look at again. We need to actually see who are we? Who are we? Who the countries and cultures who have been influenced by Christianity. The Christian identity is not our identity. The problem is, of course, that so much information has been destroyed that we're only really beginning to get a fair look at the old pagan values and who we are now, and it's taking a long time, and obviously there's quite a lot of kickback. So there are two other aspects to this book that I just want to bring in. I don't want the video to go on for too long. Nixey goes on to kind of give a timeline of the gradual kind of destruction of pagan cultures in the Western world, but I do want to talk about Ireland, and I want to talk about what happened here in Ireland. So we see apparently the first Christian bishops arriving in Ireland around 430 AD, and these monks weren't these peaceful, art-loving, song-singing hermits that you may have heard about, or you may have been taught about. Nixey talks about the kind of men who became monks at this time. This was a time when you had to be quite ferocious, and a lot of these guys were ultra violent. So the idea of a peaceful pagan conversion of Ireland is something that really needs to be looked at again. There's a letter from Pope Gregory I at around 600 AD, and he's talking about sending this letter out to his bishops saying, okay, we need to stop this killing all the pagans. What we can do instead is take over their temples, and what we can do is we can replace their gods, replace their literature, and do it that way. Now, the point is, that's 600 AD. So what was going on for about 200 years before that? That's for Ireland, of course, that would be 170 years. 170 years of Christian conquest in Ireland. Now, later on, of course, everyone has heard about St. Patrick, and this historic Patrick is a completely different figure to the St. Patrick in the hagiographies. Now, the historic Patrick done nothing. I think there's one letter from him, and he's a different figure. He's not the St. Patrick. He's not the Saint Patrick that people celebrate today. He's a man who achieved nothing and went on his way. Wasn't the first in Ireland at all. But the Patrick later on, a few hundred years later, is not a person. The Patrick later on is a system. It's a system of Christian destruction, and it's hinted at and words like vanquish turn up. There's been lots of debate about whether snakes refer to pagans. I'm not sure whether that's true, but what we do know is that something happened, and by the time we had this point where it was supposedly a peaceful conversion, the pagans are gone. There are hints in the hagiographies of atrocities taking place when they mention that Patrick vanquished druids, banished them off cliffs, went to their places and turned over their temples. We're not talking about Patrick a man, we're talking about a system, the Christian cult in Ireland, destroying the indigenous pagan culture. The people who took part in this were, in a lot of cases, the same figures who turned out to be saints. So one of the things that I have a quote here, I'll just read from it. It's from an old Irish text, and it says, the old cities of pagans, to which lengths of occupation have refused, are deserts without worship, like Lugad's house site. The little monastic sites that were settled by twos and threes are roamed with multitudes, with thousands. So what it's basically saying is, we've taken over now and we've wiped the pagans out. The place they're talking about there is the Hill of Tara, obviously, the seat of the old pagan king. So when you look then at a book like The Golden Legend, which is kind of a list of other saints and their lives, and it's a hagiography basically, we have to take these guys with a pinch of salt, because they're the same type of psychopaths that these early Christians were. So my point that I'm getting to eventually is the bringing in these guys into a cult tradition, swapping pagan saints for these Christian saints, is not as harmless, and it's not as we don't see the full effects of what we're doing here. You're basically creating a kind of egregore based upon the foundations of a psychopathic character. And I think that's something that people in occult tradition really need to look at. If you're going to put a saint on your altar, for example, when you look at Saint Cyprian and his vanquishing of a Christian, his vanquishing of a pagan because his magic was better. I mean, what that story is actually hinting at is probably an ultra-violent takeover of a pagan culture. And I think that goes all across the board. And I think Nixey's book has shown that it's propaganda, ultimately. And a book like The Golden Legend came out of that propaganda system. So it's a personal thing maybe, but I think it's something that has vast repercussions for occult practitioners who think it's harmless to kind of bring Christianity in, and sure, look, we'll blend it and it'll be this kind of folk Christianity and everything is fine. The foundations of that is bloodshed and the deaths of countless innocent people, a loss of art, a loss of history, and a loss of our own indigenous spirituality. And I think that's something we should rebel against and not try to incorporate into our system. So a bit of a personal rant there at the end, but I think the book certainly will bring passions to the fore. And I would, as I always say in this series, I would highly recommend this book. It may not seem like it belongs in the occult book review, but if you want to look at the foundations of your occult system, and I presume you do if you're watching this video, then you need to see that Christianity is not something to befriend and to assimilate and take good things from. It's something that you need to separate yourself from. Okay, so I'll talk to you again soon, and thanks for watching.